Grandpa was holding me in his lap and was shaking a little. After a few minutes, I felt something hard hit me from below. I started to stand up, so Grandpa held me by my shoulders and made me sit on his lap again and told me to move slowly. I was getting younger and younger. I started to feel strangely happy, so I took Grandpa's hand without hesitation. My name is Larabe. I was the only child of my mother. Our house was in a small area. I always lived with my mother Safia and Grandpa. My father passed away when I was a child. Grandpa had his own shops. He was running the household expenses, but he used to spend very little on expenses and spend more money on himself. His circle of friends was also wide. He used to spend all his money on friends and acquaintances. Grandpa's attitude towards my mother and me was not very good. My mother and Grandpa did not talk to me for a long time. It seemed that the relationship between the two of them was not very good. I started getting irritated because of my pitiful attitude towards meeting expenses, and because I was always angry. My mother started working in the houses of the neighborhood. Due to my mother's hard work, our conditions also started to improve a bit. I used to feel sorry for my mother because she used to do housework and outside work all day long. But she never said that I was tired. If I talked to her or asked her a question, I would get a deep silence in response. My mother was always thinking about something. It seemed like a big war was going on in her mind. During those days, my grandfather's health started to deteriorate. His old age was now affecting his movement. His condition often started to deteriorate due to joint pain. He often got fever. Suddenly, she was taking care of him. He used to stay at home most of the time. Due to his poverty-stricken life, my mother had given up all her work and started serving him. I took over the housework and the shop was not rented. The rent from the shops was used to cover the treatment of grandfather's illness and our household expenses. I used to help my mother with the rest of the housework, but my mother used to make breakfast alone because I was used to waking up late. Grandfather's condition had worsened. He had become very weak, due to which it was impossible for him to even get up. One night, my grandfather's condition worsened. When we woke up in the morning, he was burning with fever and was half dead. With the help of the locals, we, mother and daughter, took him to the hospital and it took the whole day for his condition to improve. After this incident, my mother got scared and started sleeping in her room at night to take care of my grandfather. Perhaps it was the result of my mother's loving care that my grandfather started getting better. Now my grandfather had changed with me and my mother and daughter, and now he started giving me a lot of love. But my mother was always lonely and bored. One day, I opened my eyes early in the morning. When I came out of the room, my mother was coming out of my grandfather's room at the same time. Her eyes were red and wet. She went crying and closed her hands in the room. I was surprised and suddenly thinking of my grandfather, I ran towards his room in fear. I thought that maybe something had happened to my grandfather due to which my mother was crying, but my grandfather was sleeping peacefully in his place in front of me. I went to my room shaking my head. Similarly, now my eyes often started opening early in the morning. Whenever I got up and went, my mother would be coming out of my grandfather's room crying in the same way. This had become a habit now, which was a source of worry for me. My mother used to be silent before, but now she had completely stopped. One morning, she came out of the room crying like that, so I gathered courage and asked her the reason for her crying. When she came in front of me, my mother got very scared and started avoiding me. And she scolded me and made me shut up. My mother always scolded me and made me shut up like that. Whenever I asked about my father, my mother would make excuses for some work or the other. It seemed to me that she did not love my father at all. I had never seen her mention my father. I had never heard my father's name from her mouth. I had only heard from my grandfather that my father had had a heart attack, which was the cause of his death. But now I was seeing my mother crying like this every day. For the first time in my life, I started to care about my mother. I used to watch my mother all day. She was often lost in unknown thoughts. Now I started waking up early every morning. I would get up and see my mother crying and help her make breakfast. I started worrying about my mother all the time. But I could not say anything. My mother and my close friends did not even have a relationship. She used to talk to her all the time and listen to her pain and suffering. There was always a distance between us. And this distance was also created by my mother. I tried to bridge the gap many times, but my mother did not allow me to do so. I had many complaints with my mother, but now I had to solve this problem. Why does my mother leave my grandfather's room crying? One day I thought that I should try to find out the truth of the matter myself. After thinking a lot in the evening, I sent my mother to the neighbor's house using an excuse and went to my grandfather's room and slept. When my mother came at night, she was scared to find me there and tried to wake me up, but when I did not wake up, she got tired and left the room. But that night a very strange thing happened to me. In a single night, my mother's silence and sadness were revealed to me, and the truth I came to know about my grandfather destroyed my soul. I had never thought of this even in my dreams. I had always misunderstood my mother, but today I found out that my grandfather could do such a stupid thing. That too with his own daughter-in-law. A little while after my mother left, my grandfather called my mother, and I was holding my breath. The sentence that my grandfather suddenly said on my silence shook me to the core. My grandfather suddenly said, "Sophia, daughter, forgive me for this sin, otherwise I will not die despite this torture. I am dying moment by moment. Save me. I know my sin is very great. And I salute your patience, for till today I have not uttered a single word. Otherwise I would not have been able to show my face to my granddaughter." I was breathless with surprise. I did not know for what sin my grandfather was asking for forgiveness. What did he do that made me unable to show my face? My grandfather kept talking and I was listening silently. I did not know what kind of revelation my grandfather was going to make today. My grandfather was saying, "Sophia, daughter, I am your culprit." My grandfather's next words gave me a 100-watt shock. This revelation had wounded my soul. He said that I am responsible for your desolate life and the death of my son. Your silent obedience is killing me. Daughter, I cannot sleep at night. The hardness of the grave makes me feel terrible. Grandfather was constantly apologizing, but I was lying still. I thought that my father had died naturally, but grandfather's words were revealing something else. I remained silent to know the truth, but the next moment, grandfather mistook me for a mother and my soul was destroyed. Grandfather got up trembling from his seat and came close to me and placed his hands on my feet. He was crying and apologizing. "Sophia, son, forgive me, I have committed a great sin. That is why Allah has punished me. I cannot sleep without pills and I feel a sense of anguish in my soul. I am not getting any peace anywhere. Son, forgive me, I am a cruel grandfather who orphaned your daughter for this sin." I was frightened by grandfather's words, but his act of placing his hands on my feet had silenced me. Grandfather didn't seem to care about my silence. Maybe mother would also listen in the same silence. That night I couldn't sleep. Grandfather kept crying in pain and anguish all night and kept asking for forgiveness. And new questions had arisen in my mind. Why was grandfather saying that he had killed his father? Why would a father kill his son? My condition had worsened after thinking about it. It seemed like my brain's nerves would burst if I didn't get answers to all my questions as soon as possible, so I had now set out in search of another truth. What sin was grandfather talking about? What had he done to his mother, and why and how did my father die? Towards morning, grandfather fell on his bed exhausted. He was requesting a sleeping pill in a trembling voice. I got up and picked up his medicines from the table far away and started searching for the sleeping pills. I found a sleeping pill among the medicines. I picked up that pill and gave it to grandfather along with water. He had closed his eyes silently. If there had been another time, I would have felt sorry for my grandfather, but today I was in such a strange state and my grandfather's half-truth, half-story had disturbed me and I was not feeling sad about my grandfather's condition. It seemed like my grandfather had killed my father knowingly or unknowingly. Today, my grandfather seemed like his father's murderer. But only my mother could have told me the whole story. I knew my mother would not have told me anything so easily. That morning, my condition was more or less the same as my mother's. My eyes were swollen from staying up all night. I understood that my mother would reach this state in the morning after crying and apologizing to my grandfather all night, but perhaps she did not forgive him because my grandfather was constantly apologizing to him. If my mother had forgiven my grandfather would not have apologized even today. I mean, my grandfather had done something very bad to my mother, who, my gentle mother, had not been able to forgive him and had become so hard-hearted. The next morning, my mother looked at me and sternly urged me not to sleep in my grandfather's room in the future. Rather, it would be better not to go to his place in the future. I nodded silently and started making breakfast with my mother. After finishing the work, mother and daughter sat down, and I asked my mother how my father died. My mother's face turned pale at my question. She looked around in disbelief and said that Allah had given him only this much life, but I was not satisfied with my mother's answer. I stubbornly asked my mother and said that I had now become half a child because of my grandfather's apologies throughout the night. I know the whole truth. I folded my hands in front of my mother and begged her to tell me the whole truth because my mind was misinterpreting this half of the story. I did not want me to think anything wrong about my grandfather and mother. My mother was angry at me and wanted to silence me, but today I was also closed. When I insisted on my mother, she was shocked by my words and said that she did not want her granddaughter to be turned against her at her age. Whatever had happened in life had happened and I would not do it again. But I was determined not to be told the whole truth. Mother kept on avoiding me and 2 or 3 days passed in this avoidance. My mind was always in denial about what my grandfather had said. I went on a hunger strike to get the truth out of my mother's mouth, and after not eating anything for 2 days, I started feeling sick for years in just 2 days. Because I was already weak and thin. So she gave in to my stubbornness and told me the bitter story of her life. My eyes filled with tears after hearing my mother's story. My heart filled with tears after knowing about my grandfather's such a fallen personality. I was ashamed to even call him my grandfather, which caused pain to my mother and convinced my father. Indeed, my mother's patience was the reason for giving her so much pain before her death. My mother told me that it was a marriage of her and my father's choice. My grandmother was not alive and my grandfather had always wanted to marry his orphaned niece to Tahir. My grandfather's niece lived with my grandfather. He wanted her to stay with him all her life, but my father wanted to marry my mother. Due to my father's stubbornness and fighting, my grandfather went to Harman and got my parents married, but from the first day, my grandfather never accepted my mother as his daughter-in-law. He always tried to humiliate her with excuses, but my mother silently endured everything for my father's sake. And she never spoke ill of him. She endured all his abuses silently. It was during those days of hardship and resentment that my mother got the joy of becoming a mother. Both my father and mother were happy, and instead of being happy, my grandfather became even more angry. His niece also shared this jealousy with her. My grandfather's niece had tried everything possible to prevent my mother from having children, but I was born on time. My father was very happy when I came. He loved me very much. Grandpa and his niece's tricks were at their peak and my mother started to be obsessed with me. My mother did not know that her head would fall to such an extent. I was just a few months old when Grandpa and his niece started trying to make my mother's character suspicious in front of my father. They often started calling my mother's phone from the wrong number, and sometimes a new man started appearing at the door of the house every other day. My father was forced to question my mother about such constant actions. My mother had told him the truth in anxiety that she did not know any man. My father trusted him and then he had become silent, but this matter had increased now. The ghosts started coming inside the house too. One day when my father returned from work, there was a man in her room with my mother. Mother herself was also scared of the strange man who suddenly came into the room. She was just about to ask a question when my father arrived. My father could not bear to see his wife with a stranger with his own eyes and fell to the ground, clutching his heart. Grandfather rushed him to the doctor, but the doctor said that the seizure was so severe that the patient lost his life at that moment. Grandfather and his niece's fate had changed. Instead of pushing my mother out of the house, my father silently turned his back on the world. And the house was left in mourning. Mother would have frequent fainting spells. After my father's death, grandfather became silent. He would wander around in fear due to the sudden death of his young son. And he would wake up at night and start screaming. His conscience was killing him inside. His niece had also gone half mad. And his mother had become mute forever. Time had passed. Grandfather had left his mother to her fate and had her niece treated and married off to a sensible man. The biggest loss in all this was my mother's. Her daughter had become an orphan and she had become a widow at a ripe young age. Grandfather had felt deeply the patience of his mother and his abuse during his illness. Mother had shown her love for my father by taking care of him during his illness. Grandfather now apologized every day, but mother could not muster the courage to forgive him. Every time she remembered her husband's face flushed with tears upon grandfather's apology. My mother had told me, "I wish I could forgive this man who is standing on the verge of death and counting his last days. But I cannot be so noble even if I wanted to. If he had shot and killed my husband, I would have forgiven him. But hardly any father would do something like what your grandfather did to his son. He went so far in his hatred for his daughter-in-law that he did not even think that I am his son's pride. If he throws mud at my character, then his spit will fall on his son too." I never thought even once how much pain his son must have suffered. Even today, I remember Tahir's face and eyes. There was fear of my disloyalty on his face, uncertainty in his eyes. His complaining eyes did not let me forgive myself. Tahir was in so much pain at that time. He felt that I had truly disloyalty to him, and he could not bear this shock. They didn't even give me a chance to say anything, and just like that, they got angry and left me as a bad wife. And I survived. Now every night your grandfather apologizes, he turns the past days into ashes. Now his same sister-in-law doesn't even come to ask him. She is happy with her husband and children. For which your grandfather caused such a huge loss to himself, me, and you. Now he regrets his selfishness, but what is the use of regretting now? It was too late now. I have been suffering since that day. When I lie down to sleep, I see Tahir's complaining eyes and I feel the pain rising in Tahir's chest in my chest. After listening to what my mother said, I felt like my heart would burst with pain. Then I asked my mother, "Why did you live with your grandfather? Why didn't you leave this house?" Then my mother said, "Where would you go after leaving the house? Who would keep me at home with my daughter?" I was so shocked that at first I didn't understand what had happened. I was made to sit in your grandfather's house for the Iddat. And where would I take you? You would stumble everywhere, so I stayed here so that your grandfather could become your ass worshipper. I remained silent after hearing everything. I don't know how much more life my grandfather had left. Why did my grandfather become so blinded by hatred that he caused such a great loss to himself? I was feeling very sad for my mother. On the other hand, I felt angry as well as pity for my grandfather. Because now his condition was like being pitied. Maybe someday my mother would be able to forgive him, but right now she wasn't able to do it. And I think my mother will never be able to forgive my grandfather. Tell me what I should do, my mother. Should I forgive my grandfather or not?